Hey guys, thanks for being with us again on another episode of Emergent Leadership. Today I'm fortunate to be with my friend Steve Athey with Healthcare Visions. Steve, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Brett. How are you?
I'm well, thank you for asking. So Steve, you've spent a lot of time in the industry. For those who don't maybe know you and know why I thought it was an obvious choice to bring you on my Emergent Leadership podcast, kind of give a little background of your history in the industry and what you're up to today and kind of your path to where you are, if you don't mind.
Sure. I mean, sometimes I feel like this is all I've done is work in this industry. It has been my full-time position since, 1977. And so I ran my first ambulance call in 1973, but I was doing part-time with a small company. I've been doing this as a profession since 1976. Have seen a lot of changes in the industry. I think I've held every position conceivable. And in 1997, kind of broke away from the last big company I was working for and started my own consulting firm. And I've been doing it since 1997 and probably will do it a few more years. And so, I'm a dinosaur in this business, but, I'm a dinosaur that has survived. I'm not extinct yet.
Well, you're a dinosaur with huge value. So I appreciate you.
Well, I hope so.
Being on and talking to us today. And so really what I'd like to dive into, Steve, is a lot of actually that I think there are more than one group of people, right? And we always want to put people in a box. And I think there are people who think there's an age thing to experience and you have to have, I'll give an example. One of the systems I worked in, clinically, it was if you hadn't been there for this many years and this many summers, you weren't a real paramedic, right? Or you hadn't really understood the system. Or some of those things that play in the industry that are really predominant. But there's also an age thing that I think is a hotter topic in the last few years than maybe before, with the emerging of leadership from the generation of millennials and what that looks and feels like and that real shift in dynamic. So I feel fortunate to have a conversation with you. I'm glad you're still in it and not the extinct dinosaur. Thank you. But I'm curious to talk through some of that, Steve. You started your career as an EMT, went on to be a paramedic, worked up into the operations side, ran a few systems. So you, if I'm right, you started that in 87 to 90 or 89 to, my years are wrong.
That's all right. Yeah, actually, I was working as a paramedic and just a field supervisor in the mid to late 70s. And in 1979, I transferred to Amarillo, Texas, where I became the director of operations, which was really my full-time leadership / management role that was official. I mean, I'd like to think that I exhibited leadership through all the other positions, everything from dispatch supervisor to field supervisor, all the way up and down the chain. But my first real formal position was in Amarillo in 1979.
Okay. And you say...
And the age element is really interesting because there was a time, I would say most of the folks that got into the industry around my age group in the 70s and the early 80s, we got into this business by accident. Nobody chose to get into EMS in the late 70s, mid 70s. It was just, something happened and you happened to be in the right spot at the right time and you found yourself in the EMS. In fact, when I started, it wasn't even called EMS yet. It was just an ambulance service. And I didn't even have an EMT certificate. It wasn't around yet. When I first ran my first ambulance call, I was a first aid card holder. And, you kind of get hooked. Nowadays, people are choosing to get into the business. And so there is a little difference with who's coming into the business and who finds the leadership roles and who doesn't. And I think that we're starting to see this, maybe the turn into this can really be a profession as opposed to just something that accidentally happens to you when you're a young man or woman.
Mm-hmm. I was speaking with someone the other day. It was interesting. Somebody very predominant in the industry who was telling their story, and they are pretty common even today that people have an experience. And so they choose the profession because of something that happened or something that they felt, something they experienced, and it drives that. I would be interested to know, Steve, do you feel like if that's, assuming that's the truth, that people are choosing this profession versus falling into it and sticking around, does that change the way that people show up? Does it change the path to leadership in your eyes?
I think it does. I think if you've made a conscious decision to do this, whether it's in private, third city service, fire departments, if you made a conscious decisions to get into EMS and to progress your way through the ranks, I think that changes an awful lot. I mean, there was a period of time in the mid 80s where those of us that were really getting some years underneath us in this business were looking around and not finding anybody else coming up behind us. And we actively asked that questions at the association meetings, who's going to take our places? You know, I mean, here we are, we've all been in it 15, 20 years now. That was 10, 15 years ago, and there wasn't anybody coming up behind us. And I think we're seeing, you know, an awful lot of change in that element with folks being interested in management, seeing this as a career path, you know, looking at the education they can get to move themselves along. And I think we're starting to see a change in the dynamics of who's running things now.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think, and as you're seeing these people kind of come into these positions and get excited about leadership, what do we need to be doing? Obviously, you're in a consulting role now. So you've led agencies, you've been in a high performance system, you've been the CEO of a few organizations, vice president of another. When you stepped out of that titled leadership role as an agency director and into a consulting role, do you feel like your role has changed from a leadership perspective much?
Yeah, my role has changed a great deal. You know, when you're running an organization, and I've run some very big organizations, some medium-sized and some small organizations. I've kind of been all over the place. You know, my last formal positions were with very big organizations, and I had a vast span of control and responsibilities. And, you know, that's a different leadership role than all of a sudden going into a firm or a company or an organization as a consultant where you have no authority, none whatsoever. And, you know, part of leadership means having responsibility, but also means having authority and knowing how to use it. So as a consultant, I find myself being more of a guidance counselor than anything else. And it takes far more listening than it ever did before. And then trying to push the right buttons with the organizations or with the clients or with the systems, you know, to see if we can't make the pieces fit in such a way that whatever their issues are get done. When I think back to my very first consulting job, I had been working for a major firm, had a year off when my child was very young, gave me an opportunity to stay at home with her. Mm-hmm. And you know, my friend Jenna Smith got me into the consulting role, did some work with her, broke off on my own. And my very first consulting job on my own was a very large East Coast organization. It was a third city service, and the director called me and said, "I need you to come out here, spend some time with my employees, and find out what's wrong with them." And so after about a week, I learned that what was wrong with them was him.
Yeah.
I'm not in a position to do much about that other than identify that problem, have the quite frank conversations with he and his board about what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, and what I know from my past experience, and then help getting that thing fixed and back on track. But it was interesting how that was all phrased. What's wrong with my employees? And the reality was he was what was wrong with his employees.
Right. Well, relationships are everything. And I think sometimes people forget that, and I'm hearing you say, even as a consultant, maybe even more so, listening is what makes you successful. And being able to be introspective enough to know that that's a two-way relationship is critical. And showing up for your clients or showing up for your employee base or showing up for your peers, it's not different in that way. Obviously, the purview of responsibilities changes, but it's a different guidance. So it's interesting you use the word a guidance. So really not a whole lot different than a coach, in essence, saying, let me uncover this, but you've got the pedigree to say, I've done this, here's my experience, here's what I've done, versus here's the theory behind it. And I think that's really important to grasp is what is that balance as a leader between the pedigree and the education and the checking of the boxes to say I've done it and now I can teach it, and those soft skills, Steve, like intuition and listening and understanding and the critical thinking piece. Do you think that one has a stronger weight in a leadership role than another, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's interesting. I've often thought that if I could instantly become 25 or 26 years old again, that I would be a much better manager and leader in organizations now that I've had an opportunity to go through and see other people and what their issues were. You know, one of the good things about being a consultant is it's never really my problem. I don't have to worry about, you know, the angst of who caused this, what's the problem. I'm just there to listen. And, you know, I've learned, if I've learned anything in this, I've learned that I have a great deal of respect for the people who reach out and ask for help. You know, something has happened and it either comes outside their ability to fix it, or they just can't seem to get their arms around it. I sometimes think of myself as a finisher in the fact that projects get started, they can't finish it, whether it's improving employee morale, whether it's, you know, getting CAS reviews, whatever it is, and they just need that outside voice to come in and put the dominoes in place. I think the listening skill is something that folks don't do that very well anymore. And when I think back to my, you know, the 29 plus years I've been doing this as a consultant, was kind of at the same time as a change in management was happening. We were moving from the draconian, I'm the boss, you're going to do it my way, or the highway kind of role, and really understanding that if we were going to keep people in the workforce, we're going to have to do different things with them. We're going to have to listen to them. We're going to have to pay attention to them. We're going to have to find different ways of motivating them. And I think that those are all equally important as you know, we start seeing a change in the workforce. Tons of talk in the last decade about, you know, the millennials and what's the young workforce. And, you know, a lot of folks took a lot of shots at, you know, all these young folks coming in. They don't want to work as hard. They want to be handed everything on a silver platter. You know, I have a very different opinion of that. I think some of that is true. The work ethic is different. I'm not sure it's worse.
Right.
And I will tell you that the group of employees that have come in the last decade are smarter at their age than I was at that age. And I don't know whether it's awareness, education, social media, I'm not sure what it is, but I know that these folks come in at a higher level of understanding and education. You know, we're starting to see folks in the workforce now in EMS that are college graduates. That was unheard of in my time.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So it's interesting because I think I'm in that group. And so it's hard for me to see that outside perspective. So I really appreciate your insight to say, this is what I see, you know, in the past 20 years. You know, I myself only entered into EMS in 2010. So, you know, 10 years ago, and I, even in that 10 years, have felt and seen a lot of change. And not being, you know, clinical myself, the education side is different, but, you know, I have a college education, and my experience even 10 years ago was that was not the norm. I mean, to be a female and to be very young in leadership. And so I think that's why, you know, you and I have a great relationship, because I value those differences, and it sounds like you do too, in knowing what they bring to the workforce. So you talked a lot about listening. I think a lot of people might be surprised to know that you're a self-proclaimed introvert, and you don't necessarily want to be the one on the stage saying the hard things and asking all the questions, but you do it every day as a profession, and you do it well. But I hear you have a story about a bartender named Rebecca. Share that story with us.
Yeah, yes, I wrote this. I don't know, can't remember whether it was a blog or an article that I wrote about, you know, my go-to bartender, Rebecca. It's not a real name, but it was interesting. I was in an airport. I had 3 hours to wait to catch a flight back home, and in there and struck up a conversation with the only person working in there, which was this bartender. A few other people sitting there eating sandwiches and things, and she was very talkative, and she was telling me all her stories about her family and her kids, and showing me pictures and how she has 2 or 3 jobs. And then she asked the question, this is back during the Obamacare era. She says, what do you think about this Obamacare stuff? And I gave her the 30,000 foot view answer that everybody always gave, which, well, it all depends on the details. It could be good, it could be bad, on and on and on. Just really kind of, you know, not paying attention much to what that answer should be. And she stands there and gives me 30 minutes of the basic lessons of what Obamacare is, because she's a single mom working 2 jobs on state Medicaid, and has 3 kids that she has to work through the system to get taken care of. She knew exactly what it was going to cost her. She knew exactly what the penalties were if she didn't do A, B, and C. And I was just blown away with how different that Obamacare decision at that time, what difference that made to her as opposed to what it made to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it really was an eye-opener with the fact that, you know, a few changes in Medicare, a few changes in Obamacare didn't matter to me one way or the other. I'd find a way to work around it. Insurance would take care of itself. But to her, it was life and death.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it was an interesting perspective as to how, you know, we sometimes could forget about what the other folks are having to deal with some of this.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, to me, it was just an interesting eye opener for me that, you know, I try to learn something from everybody I run across, and I learned a real lesson from Rebecca that day.
Mm-hmm. I love that story. I think it's important. And when you're in a role and you're in a consulting role, or you're leading an agency, or you're managing supervising a team, or you've got two people, you know, report to you or not, I think the lesson that I'm hearing out of that story is to learn people, take the time to learn people. And you said open your eyes. Maybe you understand something that you didn't before. Maybe it's a reminder, maybe it's a perspective, but to take something from every one of those relationships that you have forged means you have to forge some sort of a relationship, even if it's a 30-minute conversation, a diatribe about the Affordable Care Act, or, you know, there's an interaction that happens that then causes something in you. So even as an introvert, you know, listening was enough to soak into something that triggered something new, something thought-provoking. And I think that's really what the industry, you know, really needs, is people to stand up and say, this is what I see, this is my perspective, and maybe just saying what it is, and not even engaging in a debate, not necessarily about, you know, who's right or who's wrong. To your point, it was really kind of a flippant response. It was well, we'll see.
Right.
You know, and maybe that's okay for you, but for her, it was a passion, it was a drive, it was valuable. And so I think just being able to hear and recognize what people value and what's important to them and what affects them is what makes you a good consultant. What makes people a good leader is by listening, and really, truly, you know, listening to understand versus listening to hear. I think that's a very valuable lesson. So you obviously have been through a few big industry changes, and we're going through a lot right now. Is there anything, as you're thinking about or taking a step back during COVID period, going, this feels familiar, or this feels new, that's kind of been triggered in you lately based on some of those things you've already experienced, Steve?
Well, you know, of course, we've all been homebound, so it's you know, it's hard to have a real, you know, today's perspective on things. But it is, I've been thinking an awful lot about what happens when all this blows over. And first of all, I think we're going to have huge financial consequences when it all blows over. Things are going to be very different. But when I think about, you know, my industry, the EMS industry, and the leadership and management, you know, I think it's never going to be as important as it is today. I just think that we're going to find ourselves having to do more with less, you know, to be able to make our systems work today. You know, as I've been telling people, everybody's call volume dropped 40 to 50%, and now it's starting to climb back up. But I don't think it's going to come all the way back. So that's going to mean an entire shift in revenue stream, which means, you know, you're going to have to find some corners to cut somewhere along the line. So let's say you're in a system that's got 5 field supervisors, and now you can only have 4. You know, let's say you've got an operations manager and an assistant operations manager. Now one of those people have to go. You know, the remaining folks have to get better. They have to be better at a leader. They have to be better at a manager. You know, and I know there's a lot of distinctions between whether you're a leader or a manager, whether you're a combination. But everybody in an administrative role, whether it's a leadership role or a management role, is going to have to be better. And they're going to have to figure out how to do it, sometimes on the run, because there's not going to be a lot of time to say, all right, let's stop now. We're going to have to reset what's going on with COVID, and we better figure out how to make you better at what you do. I've got some clients that believe they're going to thrive after this because they have changed things. They saw that maybe they had some misappropriated resources that they could put in better places and do it a different way. And there's some folks that are worried that they're not going to make it. There's been some that haven't made it after this. But I think leadership is going to have to ramp up, if you will. And that's a tough thing, because I don't know that you teach leaders. I think leaders can learn things, but I don't know you teach leaders. I'm a real believer that leadership comes an awful lot from your innate abilities and your personalities and your skill set. Always make it better, but if, I don't know that you could take a person who doesn't have leadership ability and teach them to be a leader. So we're going to have to find them. We're going to have to go get them, and we're going to have to find them, and we're going to have to put them in the places that make some sense.
So what does better mean to you? When you're talking about capacity, you're like, leaders are going to have to step up. They're going to have to be better. What does that mean to you?
I wanted to go back to something you said earlier. You said, listening to how people feel and what's important to them. I've had an opportunity in the last couple of years to spend some time doing employee surveys and work with the employees. And it's I don't want to say it's fun, but it's not painful to get up in front of a group of employees when they're not your employees and ask them what's going on in your lives, what's important to you, what do you like, what don't you like. And I've got some very brave clients that have asked me to come in and spend time with their workforces and find out what works and what doesn't work. And there's an awful lot of commonalities with what you hear with these men and women. And I kind of did the math the other day as I was getting ready for this. And I would say in the last couple of years, I've been in front of 1,000 employees, just in an open room with none of the management personnel around, and just had an opportunity to talk to them. And what I hear from them is leadership and management and supervision that's not right. And they've given me lists of things that are important to them and are key to them that don't cost money. We'd all like to pay more money to folks. And, we're in an industry that, our revenue is set by payers and payer mixes. And there's not money that you can just go dip into to pay employees more. Mm-hmm. And so I'm a real believer that if you can't fix that, you need to fix the things you can fix. And a lot of that has to do with employee relations and how we're doing things wrong. And I think if you get better there, I've always believed that the hardest job in EMS is the field supervisor. I mean, here's the man or woman who's just come up through the field, all his buddies, her buddies, and now here they are, they're in charge. They typically have very little experience. And if they don't have an innate ability to get people to do their work without them being there, because remember, we don't make widgets in a factory floor. We see our people maybe 20 minutes a week, and then we send them off on an ambulance like a fighter jet, and we say, go forth and do what you're supposed to do. And if you haven't led them properly, they're not going to do it. And I hear, these employees have taught me a ton about what's important to them and what they're missing in their own workplaces and what they do value.
Mm-hmm. 1,000 people is a pretty good population set. What things are coming up regularly or more frequently in recent times?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer to that is sometimes a little surprising. Fairness is a common theme. Mm-hmm. And that trickles down into everything that goes on in an EMS organization. Everything from promotions to performance evaluations to shift bidding to everything. Every employee knows in their own mind that they think that they're better than this person and worse than this person. And it fries them when somebody is being treated as well as they are when they know they're not doing their job. And so inconsistent management is one of the things, and not being fair is two really big things with the employee work group. The one that pops up almost every time, which is pretty fascinating really, is usually the group is unhappy because the employer fails to fire. That there's a group of employees down there that need to be gone from the organization, and the employees who believe they should stay. And I'm not trying to make any judgment on who's right or who's wrong, but it's always amazing to me that a group of men or women in a room will eventually get to the point that I can't believe they let this person stay here.
Well, it goes back to fairness and,
yes.
and feeling like there's, dare to quote, the weakest link here, but you said, what was that show years ago? It was like, you are the weakest link, goodbye.
I don't remember, but yes, I remember that.
Yeah. So I just, you have this weakest link concept. And I'm going to quote you because you said that in a strategic session that I was in with you years ago. You said, really, you have to know where you are. There's a baseline, but you're only as strong as your weakest link, and you've only got you've got to rise people up. And I hear you saying it's not about necessarily getting rid of that person. It's about helping them rise up and then supporting them in that and leading them in that. And then again, if you can't, and that's a different conversation, right? That's a very management function to help someone rise up and to try to coach them. And there is that point in which they're not going to get there. They don't want to, or it's not, or they're not in the right seat, or whatever that looks like. That's a very management conversation. But
right.
from a I'm the employee, I want to be treated fairly. You know, that's a team thing. That's a team building thing. And so when you've got people on your team that you don't trust, that's difficult. It's difficult to show up and feel like you're fulfilling your purpose and you're doing everything you can do because you've got that in the back of your head. I also think I took a course recently it was one of those free courses through Coursera. If you ever do any online learning in your time at home, or if any of our listeners do, it was through Yale. It's a Yale professor called The Science of Well-Being. And this professor talked a lot about that concept of what is happiness, and exactly what you just described is the science of humans. And the way that we operate is people from a social studies publication would rather make less money and be aligned with their peers than to make more money but be on a different pay scale. I thought that was very fascinating to say, I would rather make $50,000 a year than 100. If all my peers are making 52, I'm good with it. If I'm making 100 and one of my peers is making 250 or even 103, I'd rather make less. And so there's definitely this human interest in equality and fairness. So that to me is not the most surprising answer that I think you could have gotten, but very cool to see that it does play out in the everyday and where that comes from.
Yeah, in management science, they've got, all sorts of theories, and one of them, there's an equity equation where people are always measuring themselves against others in their workplace, and they're also then measuring themselves against other workplaces and the people in there, which is an interesting different dichotomy. But when you're measuring yourself against others, yes, there's the skill levels. I may be a great paramedic. Maybe this person's not so good. Maybe this person's a super medic. But it really has more to do with how they're being treated. And am I being treated equitable? And that doesn't mean equal.
Right.
It means equitable. I mean, if I'm a better employee than you, I should have more equity than you do in their eyes. Now, that's sometimes impossible. I understand that. But, we're talking about what their needs are, not so much are they possible to meet at this point. And probably the last one that comes up almost all the time is communications. Nobody ever believes they're being communicated with enough. And I've been in a lot of organizations that go out of their way to communicate with the employees, but it's not always the right things. I think companies, organizations sometimes feel like we shouldn't be talking to our workforces about this. Trust me, they're talking about it. They know all the ins and outs. One meeting that was particularly brutal again, this was an East Coast company, was having a hard time with shortages, and they were short of paramedics and EMTs. And one guy was getting very emotional about it because they're being held over, they're being called in, their pages were constantly going off in an attempt to get them into work. And it was, like I said, it was a large organization. And he said to me, he stood up and he said to me, he goes, there are 22 people in that office that have a paramedic license that aren't working the streets. I thought, that's interesting. I wrote that down as he was talking. Next day, when I was
check later, note to Steve Athey.
Next time I was in the office and talking to the administrators, I said, how many people do you have here are paramedic certified that don't work the street? Want to know how much it was? 22.
Oh, I believe that.
And, this was a street medic. And it was amazing that, the work group had figured it out, that there were folks there that could act as a resource that weren't. And and they just felt like they weren't being communicated with things they could have been of value to.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that you can ever over communicate, Steve?
There are times I'll stop listening. And so if that's a matter of over communicating, then maybe so. And I think I sent you one of the articles that I'd written, the things I wished I hadn't said. And one of the things I wished I hadn't done was I was holding biweekly meetings twice a week with the workforce in the major company I was working for.
Wow.
And after a while, the first 10 of them were painful. The next 10, there was less people, on and on and on. And so one day, after about 4 weeks, I go into the meeting and there's one person sitting there. And I say to him, just stop by my office tomorrow and let's chat if you don't want to, but we're not going to hold a meeting here just for one person.
Sure.
A horrible thing for me to do. And I wished I hadn't done that, because about 5 years after that, when we were both in different places, saw him at a conference and he called me on it. And I thought, you're right. That was a bad thing for me to do. So I should have over communicated. I should have sat there and held that meeting with him, that one person. I don't know that would have made any difference anywhere along the line, but, I think you've got to continue to make the effort. And I don't know that it always means employee meetings. There's lots of different ways of doing it.
Interesting that I was curious what you thought the problem there was. Was it the asking him to come back to the office the next day? Was it not respecting that he had shown up? Where do you believe the mistake was in that?
I think it was not respecting that he showed up. I think I discounted his effort to be there.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because you said, how many people were in the meetings to begin with?
30 or 40 at a time.
Yeah.
And, after a while, when you send the message, they go out and send the message, and after it trickles down, and after a while people go, I don't need to go hear that. I've already heard it from my friend or my peer or my coworker.
Sure. Oh, well, I think that there's, I'm sure, so many lessons that you could learn and share, and that's why you're a consultant and you're still living and breathing it every day, because you have a lot of value and stories. So I appreciate you sharing them with me, Steve. Is there anything, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit ago, but have there been any like aha moments, any big things that if you say, hey, leaders of tomorrow, beware of this thing, or you may not see this yet. Is there anything that you think is really this impending, make sure you don't miss this, that you've learned from your experiences, or just lessons learned to take with us as we go about our days and our leadership?
I don't know that it's new. I think I've always felt this way, but I think one of the big things that folks need to know about leadership, at least in my opinion, is that not everybody's cut out for it. It is hard. It is agonizing at times. When you make a mistake as a leader, you're now affecting 500 to 500 people, depending upon, who you are.
Or 5,000.
Right. And, I used to think being a paramedic was stressful and hard. If I made a mistake, there's one person affected. Now, hopefully it wasn't a horrible mistake, but, there was one person there. You make a mistake, running a major company, and you've got 400 or 500 people that you now affected. So I think one of my big lessons that I always like to give people is, you can't expect everybody to be a leader, and don't try to push somebody who's not in line to be a leader, not expecting to be a leader, not wanting to be a leader. Don't try to make them one. And, you'll figure it out. You'll figure out the ones that should be there. There's, I spent a whole lot of years as a leader/manager without ever reading anything about the science of it. And once I got into reading about the science of it and reading every book I could, there were some lessons, and I learned a great deal. But I think an awful lot of what I brought to the table was, I'd been a leader in every job I'd done, everything from washing dishes to working in the woods. I found myself either being the boss or the foreman or the supervisor, and I'd never had any training at all. First of all, I was the perfect employee. I could count on one hand the amount of times I purposely broke a rule. I just never did it. I was the most boring guy on earth, but I never broke a rule on purpose. And I wanted to be the leader. I liked being in that role. And, I think I had the personality to make it work. Sometimes leadership can be hidden by just good personality and friendship and friendliness. But I think I had an ability to do it. I learned an awful lot as I got educated about it. But I think that the point is you've got to, as a manager, as an owner or manager or an executive director, you've got to find your best way of identifying who you think the potential leaders are. And, we could spend another week on, how do you do that? Because there's, there's scientific ways, HR groups like Aveste, those sort of people, they have put together algorithms that help you pick the hardwired elements of what a leader should look like. And your workforce will help you with the other ones. But I think that it's a matter of, really trying to identify the folks out there that make it work the best.
Sure. So if you had to go back to 25-year-old Steve and give yourself all the lessons learned, would you do it again? Would you take the leadership path a second time?
Oh, I would. I mean, there's a ton of things I'd do different. Trust me, we all would, right? If we could go back in time, especially knowing what we know now. But I would take it again. I've enjoyed my roles. I felt like I added value everywhere I went. When part of my good fortune has been timing. I hit this industry at a time when it was exploding. When the federal grants started in the late 70s, and for 22 years, I moved every 3.1 years.
3.1. Who's counting?
Lots of people count it, trust me.
You're not wrong. I got actually, this story, but I actually was asked that in an interview. Somebody looked at me and said, you moved at 3 years and 1 month from your first job, and 3 years and 1 month in this second, that you've been in the second job. So should we anticipate that in 3 years and 1 month you leave? And I basically turned around and said, well, what's your plan to keep me for three years and 2 months, right? I guess it all depends on the style. And I think that's the mindset that a lot of people take. I don't think I'm a big exception in that way.
No, and back then, as the industry was exploding and growing, and I went through the mergers and acquisition periods of the 90s, if you were any good at all, you could name your place basically where you wanted to go. And I always moved for a bigger place or more responsibility. Now, this will show you how smart I am. I didn't always move for more money, which I think back on that, that's one of the things I would fix. But, I enjoyed the new challenges, and I made those moves, and I'm happy that I did. And, this is the longest I've ever been in one spot in my life as a consultant, because, Texas is a good place to have a home base. Don't have to fly coast to coast, good air travel out of DFW, and we're happy here. All my kids are here. And so it works out
Don't tell
great.
everybody. They're already figuring that out, Steve.
Yes, they are.
DFW is a great home spot. A lot of healthcare leaders here too, and a lot of systems that are based or moving to Texas. So you're not the only one that feels that way. But Steve, I really appreciate your time and your expertise, and I hope you stick around the industry as long as you can, and continue to impart your knowledge and experiences with others. So thank you for your time today, and thanks for being with me.
Well, Brett, thank you. It was really nice to get the call from you, and I always enjoy working with you, and hope to do this again. And we touched on a couple articles I wrote and things that people want to read more. I've got a website, hcvems.com for healthcare visions. You can get a hold of me from there if you want to. Be happy to talk with anybody, and looking forward to seeing you again.
Thank you for the reminder. I told him before this call that I would forget the touch base. He's a good man. Thank you for the reminder. So I'll put if you're watching the video, I'll put the link to get a hold of Steve Athey on the video. If you'd like to reach out to both of us, obviously I'll tag him in all the posts and everything. So thank you again, Steve. Have a great rest of your day.
You too, Brett. Thanks.